Today is a video many of you have been waiting for in my Colle Zukertort playlist, how to counter pawn g6 early on in our setup. Today I show you the formations I play against pawn g6, as well as I show you a trap that has actually been successful for me against 1800 plus players more than 50% of the time when they play an early g6. So when we play pawn to d4, our opponent can either play g6 right away, which isn't very common, or they can play knight f6. Now knight f6 is very common because it's a flexible move. It allows our opponent to play moves like c5, the banco. It can play pawn d5, just the normal setup. It can play pawn g6, our focus for today, the King's Indian. They can even play things like the Nimzo Indian with pawn a6. But we're going to continue like usual. We're going to play knight to f3. And this is where most players, they'll just play pawn g6. And this is what we call the King's Indian. Now, the King's Indian setup is pretty normal. We usually just play pawn c4 in the main line variation of the King's Indian, and we go for this setup. But I'm not going to do this setup because this is the setup that my opponents are going to be aware about, and if my opponents know what they're doing, they're going to have an advantage over me, someone who doesn't know what to do against this variation. So I'm going to be showing you an opening that I play, as long as a trick that I use to beat a lot of pawn g6 players. And so how this setup works is I like to play bishop f4. I know usually in our Colle we like to put a bishop on b2, we like to put our bishop on d3, but our attack is not going to be very successful over here. And the reason why attack's not going to be successful is because he'll have two extra defenders. This g6 pawn is going to be defending his king, but the bishop on g7 is very troublesome. But I realize, if his pieces are all on the king side defending, what if we send our pieces to the other side? And that's the point of this opening. My opponent's going to play a move like bishop g7. We're going to play pawn c4. We're not playing a London here. We're not going to play c3, e3. But we're going to play pawn c4, gaining a lot of space. Our opponent might play pawn d6. We can play pawn e3. They're usually castle. And we're going to play knight to c3. Now, our setup is almost complete. It's actually very simple. If our opponent plays something like knight c6 or knight d7, doesn't really matter. Usually what I like to play here is I like to play h3. I like to stop the bishop from coming here, the knight from going here. But most importantly, if the knight goes to h5, or if he ever gets e5 in, my bishop can retreat to a very safe square on h2. Now, okay, let's just say our opponent develops normally. Let's just say, I don't know, they play pawn a6. We can play bishop e2. We're going to castle kingside to complete our setup. And we're going to go for a massive queenside attack. As you guys can see, we're going to have a very big queenside over here. And this is a very nice setup. Now, you might ask, okay, so what if our opponent goes for a normal e5 idea? In the King's Indian, it is very normal for people to try to go for this e5 move. In fact, whenever I play this variation, I would say at least 60%, 70% of my opponents actually go for this e5 move because that's the idea they usually go for in the King's Indian. But you can't actually go e5 here. And the reason why is, well, it's just a free pawn, as you guys can see. So this is where the trap actually begins. And this is where I think 60-70% of players that I've played against, people who are 2000 plus, they fall for this trick where they just try to play knight d7, trying to play pawn e5. I usually just play h3, like I said before. I'm kind of scared of knight h5. And when my opponent plays rook e8, I play the inconspicuous bishop to e2. And the trap is set. And I've had so many people fall for this trap. So make sure you study this well and make sure you remember this because it could very well happen in your own games. So pawn e5 looks safe. They have 1, 2, 3 defenders and we only have 3 attackers. Generally, in chess, if there are equal defenders and attackers, your attack is not going to work at all. But in this position, I want you guys to actually pause your video. I know this is a guide, so you can skip forward if you want, but I want you guys to actually use your brains and try to calculate this for a second. Think why this e5 move is actually a blunder, and why this, even though it's the most common move in normal King's Indians, it's actually a huge mistake in this position. So I'm going to tell you guys the answer is 3, 2, 1, but the answer is simple. You just take the pawn. And when they capture back, this is the brilliant move that so many opponents have fallen for, is just take the pawn and say, take me. I don't care if you take me, because if you take me, Well, I will take your queen in between move, and now the rook is forced to capture back, and you're just literally up a pawn in this position. I've won so many positions in this exact position because my opponents blunder a pawn based off what they know. As you guys know, the openings I enjoy are the openings where my opponents are not aware and they're not used to the setups, which means that you have an advantage going into these openings. Now, let's do some quick review from the beginning because there's one other variation I want you guys to learn and want you guys to know. So, okay, d4, knight f6, knight f3, pawn g6. Again, don't play e3, play the bishop out early because you're starting your attack on the queen side. Bishop g7, pawn c4, castle king side, knight c3. You can play e3, knight c3, both don't really matter. Pawn d6, pawn e3. Now, in this position, okay, your opponents generally, if they're a little bit smart, they won't go for this e5 idea. They might go for this pawn c5 idea. And what I like to do against pawn c5 is actually very simple, is I like to ignore it at first. Again, I like this h3 move a lot, and I just develop my pieces very normally like this. And what I do eventually is I go for one of two setups here. I can go for an a3 rook b1 b4 idea, which it's pretty fine. I think it's pretty good. Or we can go for a d5 idea with the idea of kicking the knight away so we can play e4, e5 and just smash our opponent in the center. And one of the best things in this position is usually your opponent's best defense is go knight g4, bishop g4, but you're actually blocking both of this with this h3 move from before. This bishop on f4 is actually such a useful bishop. It aims down across the board, attacking, piercing into the center, attacking the queen side, and you usually have a good time. Now, you might ask, what other setups or what other openings can this setup actually work against? Now, I know this isn't the Colle Zukertort, and I know you guys want to play the Colle Zukertort against everything, but there's no one opening that you can play against everything. I play three main setups when I play d4. One is the Colle Zukertort, as you guys know. The very basic setup, I have an entire playlist for that. But against d4, in my yesterday's video, I actually show you guys how I countered the Dutch. And how I countered the Dutch is the exact same setup. So make sure you check out that video if you guys want to see how I dismantle someone using a pretty solid queenside attack. I think that was a pretty nice game, so make sure you take a look at that from yesterday. But again, I go for this simple setup. I don't care what my opponent is going for once he has the Dutch here. I'm just going for the same setup, and I go for a large queenside attack. Make sure, and I repeat, make sure you do not go for a kingside attack. If you go for a kingside attack, you will get a very bad position. Instead, you have to go for a queenside attack where all your pieces are heading. Now, what other setups do I play this against? Well, you could technically play the setup against everything. Technically, if you like this setup better than, the setup I just showed you, even against d5, this is fine. You could play this instead of the Colle Zukertort, but again, it does have its dangers because your opponent has a pawn d5. That's why I recommend it only really against pawn g6, against the Dutch defense, whether it's the stone wall or the Leningrad variation, whichever variation. I think this setup is actually very nice. So let's review it one more time. Knight f3, g6, bishop f4, bishop g7, pawn c4, castle, regaining a lot of space on the queen side, knight c3, pawn d6, e3, knight d7, bishop e2, and in this position if they play rook e8, I like to just play h3, kind of baiting my opponent to playing e5. One game I played against someone, I didn't play h3, I think I just castled here. My opponent played e5, capture, capture, knight captures, queen captures, rook captures, bishop captures. I remember that they played rook to d2, but I want you guys to pause your video one last time in this video. Let me know what you would play in this position to actually counter this rook d2 move that looks very aggressive. It looks like it's invading my space. It looks like there's a lot of compensation for your opponent here. But pause your videos, and in 3 seconds, 3, 2, 1. Well, the answer is you play rook to d1. Either rook was fine, but the idea is they cannot take the pawn. If they take the pawn here, this is actually really bad because you have rook to d8, bishop blocks, you win the knight, and you win the game. And that's that. So let me know in the comment section below if this guide was actually useful to you. And let me know, actually, come back to this video in the future if this trap actually worked for you.